Donald Trump was not asking the world to win the whole Iran war for him. By mid-March 2026, he was asking something narrower, but in some ways more revealing. He wanted other countries to help protect the Strait of Hormuz. He wanted allied navies to move into the world's most dangerous energy choke point, escort shipping, and help reopen the artery through which a huge share of global oil and gas moves. In plain political language, he was asking them to help protect the route that keeps their own economies alive, and even then, most of them would not do it. That is what makes this moment so devastating for Trump. If he had asked them to join a full-scale invasion of Iran, refusal would have been predictable. But that was not the immediate appeal. The public case he made was simpler and more strategic. America had done the heavy fighting, and now other countries that benefit from Gulf energy should help protect the shipping lane. AP reported that Trump complained he had been unable to rally support behind securing Hormuz, while Bloomberg reported that he stepped up calls for countries to send warships so commercial vessels could sail through safely. This is why the story hit so hard online. It looked like the President of the United States had ignited a war and then turned around and asked other nations to guard the exit. And Hormuz is no minor waterway. The IEA says an average of 20 million barrels per day of crude oil and oil products move through the Strait of Hormuz in 2025, making it one of the world's most critical energy choke points. The EIA says flows through Hormuz accounted for more than 1/4 of total global seaborne oil trade and about 1/5 of global oil and petroleum product consumption, while around 1/5 of global LNG trade also passed through it. So when Trump asked other governments to help protect Hormuz, he was not talking about defending a distant patch of water. He was talking about defending one of the central pressure valves of the global economy. That is precisely why the refusals were so striking. AP reported that NATO and most other allies rejected Trump's calls to help secure the strait. The Washington Post reported that European leaders pushed back hard, frustrated by Trump's unilateral approach and wary of being drawn into a war he had started without consulting them. The Guardian reported that Trump lashed out after countries including the UK, Japan, Australia, and South Korea declined to participate in the naval effort he wanted. So the humiliation was not that the world ignored an obscure White House proposal. The humiliation was that even on the narrow question of protecting the energy lifeline, Trump still could not build a coalition. That is the core of the drama. He asked them to protect the strait, and they still would not step in. He was not merely asking for applause, statements of concern, or a symbolic vote at the United Nations. He was asking for ships, sailors, flags, and political ownership. He was asking them to stand beside the United States in a live-fire maritime zone and absorb the risk of Iranian retaliation. Once viewed that way, the refusals become even more brutal. These were not governments saying the strait did not matter. They were governments saying the strait mattered enormously, but not enough to trust Trump with their navy. Japan is one of the most painful examples. Bloomberg reported that Trump openly hoped Tokyo would help keep the strait open and safe, but Japanese officials said dispatching ships would face high hurdles, and Japan's defense minister said there were no plans to send warships. That is extraordinary because Japan is one of the countries with the most to lose from Hormuz disruption. The IEA says Japan is particularly reliant on crude flows through the strait, and AP reported that Japan was already turning to strategic reserves and emergency measures as the war disrupted energy supplies. In other words, Trump was asking one of the countries most exposed to Hormuz chaos to help protect Hormuz, and even Japan still held back. South Korea fits the same pattern. AP reported that South Korea, like Japan, was among the countries already dealing with energy disruptions and reserve pressures as the war choked fuel flows. The Guardian included South Korea among the countries Trump criticized for declining his request. South Korea has every reason to want the shipping lane stabilized. It is a major industrial economy, a heavy energy importer, and deeply exposed to spikes in fuel, petrochemical, and freight costs. But Seoul still did not rush to send warships. That tells you something profound. The economic need to reopen Hormuz was not enough to overcome the political fear of being dragged deeper into Trump's war. Europe's refusal is even more politically devastating for Trump because it stripped away his favorite argument, that allies owe America. The Washington Post reported that European leaders were reluctant to join a conflict Trump started without consulting them, while AP reported that the EU did not want to be drawn into a war it had neither initiated nor been consulted about. Trump's logic was simple. These countries benefit from global trade and US power, so when the world's most important oil passage is under threat, they should help protect it. Europe's answer was colder. You do not get to start the fire alone and then hand us a hose after the building is already burning. And yet Europe is not immune to Hormuz at all. The EIA says the strait is responsible for roughly 1/5 of global oil consumption and about 1/5 of LNG trade, which means any major disruption hits world prices, not just direct importers. AP reported that Europe was less directly exposed than Asia, but was still being pushed into energy triage, longer-term adjustments, and a fresh struggle with price shocks. So Europe refused not because Hormuz was irrelevant. Europe refused because it preferred inflation to entanglement, market pain to military escalation, and energy shock to strategic submission under Trump's leadership. Britain and France showed how narrow the opening really was. The Washington Post reported that Britain and France showed at most limited willingness tied to a later, narrower maritime role, not immediate entry into the current war. That matters. It means even the countries most capable of joining such an operation were trying to separate protecting shipping in principle from joining Trump's war in practice. They were trying to keep one foot in the alliance and one foot out of the blast radius. That is not solidarity, that is controlled distance. Australia's refusal sharpened the embarrassment further. Reuters, via widely syndicated reporting, said Japan and Australia had no plans to send ships. The Guardian also listed Australia among the countries Trump hit out at after being rebuffed. Australia is not as directly dependent on Gulf energy as Japan or South Korea, but it still lives in the same globally priced oil system and in the same Asian market ecosystem that convulses when Hormuz is hit. Yet Canberra still chose not to step into the waterway. Again, the message was not that the strait did not matter. The message was that helping protect it under Trump's wartime command looked more dangerous than staying out. The economic backdrop made the refusal even more dramatic. AP reported that the war had pushed Brent crude above $103 a barrel and driven U.S. gasoline to its highest level since 2023, while other AP reporting described countries across Asia scrambling to conserve power, tap reserves, and manage soaring energy costs. The IEA said Hormuz traffic had fallen to less than 10% of pre-conflict levels, with limited capacity to bypass the route. So Trump was asking for naval help at the exact moment the world could see the financial consequences of inaction in real time. Prices were rising, supply chains were straining, governments were burning through emergency options, and still, they did not line up behind him. Why? Because the request itself carried a hidden admission of weakness. A president who is fully in control does not need to publicly pressure half the industrial world to protect a shipping lane after launching the war that endangered it. Trump tried to frame the request as burden sharing. America had done the hard part. Now others should defend their own interests. But the optics moved the other way. The more he pushed, the more it looked like he was asking allies to rescue the global consequences of his own decision. The Washington Post and AP both framed allied resistance around the same themes: lack of consultation, fear of escalation, and distrust of Trump's strategy. That is why the online phrase "he begged them" spread so quickly. It exaggerates the wording, but it captures the political image. And that image is the real wound. Trump wanted them to protect Hormuz because Hormuz protects everything else: oil flows, LNG supplies, shipping rates, inflation outlooks, industrial costs, and the economic nerves of allies from Tokyo to Berlin. He asked countries that depend on that passage to come and defend it with him. But instead of a coalition, he got hesitation, caveats, legal objections, diplomatic hedging, and blunt refusal. In the most important maritime bottleneck on Earth, with the global energy system under stress, the United States discovered that fear of Iran was still smaller than distrust of Trump. That is why this is bigger than a naval story. It is a story about power without consent. Trump could launch strikes, Trump could threaten enemies, Trump could demand loyalty, but when he asked other nations to help protect the strait, even countries whose economies depend on that route refused to hand him their ships. That is not just a diplomatic setback, that is a verdict. It means the world may still fear the crisis, but it does not trust him to lead the rescue.